QSO Today, episode 535, Michael Goldstein, VE3GFN. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSOtoday.com webpage. If you are new to the QSO Today podcast, please be sure to look at the QSOtoday.com website, where we have over 500 interviews with amateur radio operators. From there, you can click on the links that take you to the QSO Today Academy. Our catalog contains over 500 videos on every ham radio subject, completely searchable. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur callsign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates, through in-depth interviews, just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. Elwood Downey, WB0OEW, creator of Ham Clock, passed away recently. Elwood was a big fan of the QSO Today podcast and frequently contacted me about episodes that he enjoyed. His Ham Clock project appears as End of Life in June of 2026. However, I see that there are attempts to keep the project alive. I have a Ham Clock screen in my shack and look forward to the new open source project to fill it out. So long, Elwood. May your memory be for a blessing. George KJ6VU, host of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, made an appeal to make the Workbench All-Star Hub 55915 more active. From his announcements, I have made a few QSOs there, and I hope that it will become more active. Please join me by connecting your All-Star node to 55915. The link is in the show notes page. Michael Goldstein, VE3GFN, has spent more than 70 years in the hobby, spanning the full arc of amateur radio's technical evolution. Licensed in the 50s, Mike began as a dedicated home brewer and CW operator, later designing receivers published in Bill Orr's W6SAI's Radio Handbook, and built a professional career in electronics instrumentation at the University of Toronto. In this interview, he reflects on his mentors, Morse code, classic and modern radios, contesting at 100 watts, and the transition from vacuum tubes to today's SDR transceivers, sharing practical insight and perspective earned over a lifetime on the air. VE3GFN is my QSO Today. VE3GFN, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Mike?
VE3 Good for Nothing is on site.
Mike, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. You say on your QRZ page that ham radio has been the engine that has driven your life. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did you engage that engine?
Oh, back in junior high school, I think, I was taking a course in basic electricity, bells and buttons and batteries, and I found this fascinating. So I went out and bought bells and buttons and batteries, brought them all home, wired the house so that if I pushed a button in the basement, my mother would go to the front door to answer the doorbell, which of course was me. And that was kind of fun, but kind of limiting. And I thought there must be more than this to electricity. As it happened, I had an uncle who used to be a VE1, but was now a W9 IVP in Chicago. My uncle Ron, and I wrote him a letter and said, bells and buttons and batteries, is there anything more that I can do? And he sent me this publication from the ARRL called How to Become a Radio Amateur. And that was the start of my life. In fact, I that later on posted on the ARRL's website, and I've got the 2 or 3 pertinent pages of it now framed and displayed up on my rec room wall. Anyway, there was a little receiver in there that they talked about, built on a couple of pieces of wood. And so I built that receiver, a 1-tube receiver, and I guess you'd call it a 1-tube blooper these days. You remember the 1-tube bloopers? Anyway, it didn't work. And it was probably due to my construction techniques, because I borrowed a soldering iron from my dad, who was in the dry cleaning business. And it was about a 150 watt soldering iron. And he gave me some solder, which was, of course, not Kester 2020 or whatever. And I used that to solder all the connections. And my technique for soldering was to melt some solder on the end of the iron and then apply it to the connection I was trying to solder, which, of course, is totally wrong. Anyway, it didn't work. It never worked. And I put it aside and started making model airplanes until my cousin, who was W9IVP's son, and also a ham, W8VR, Al Hart, came to town one day and looked at my efforts and kind of barfed and said, well, I think I can make this work. So first he had to go to one of our mutual ham friends and borrow some tools, came back and tore the whole receiver apart, soldered it all up properly. And when it was finished, it worked. And I could hear, I think, the local broadcast station on it, among other things.
Well, I think all of our fathers had that 150 watt soldering iron because I think they used it at that time for fixing the radiator on the car.
Absolutely. That was a good radiator fixer, soldering iron, but
that was the first soldering iron I used. Yeah, as well.
Not too good for electronics though. As I
little acid core solder.
Absolutely, acid core solder. That's what you wanted. And I don't know how long that radio actually worked because we had used acid core solder on it originally, and all the connections, I guess, were busy corroding. Anyway, that was the start. Later on, I got a much better receiver with a Hallicrafters SX99. I used that for a lot of years. In fact, it's still sitting and I hope working in the basement of my best friend in Halifax. I donated it to him when I left for Toronto, and the last time I visited him, it was still there, but I didn't turn it on.
What was the hometown?
I was in Halifax, in Nova Scotia.
So that's where you grew up,
right?
And how old? What year was it that you got the first ARRL? How to become a radio amateur and started building that receiver?
13 or 14, so that would be about 1953 or 4, I guess. I was ultimately licensed in 1956.
Okay.
So that was the beginning of my ability to say hello to hams.
And what call sign did you get? The same one you have now?
No. I have a VE3 call sign now. I'm in Ontario. But in Halifax, I had a VE1 call sign, VE1 ADH, VE1 Awful Dangerous Hombre. In fact, I was going to say the ham up in Cape Breton who gave me those phonetics also gave me my VE3 phonetics, VE3 Good for Nothing. He was a mad Scotsman from Cape Breton Island, but he had a knack for good phonetics.
Now, in those days, were there different levels of licensing in Canada? And so were you at an entry-level license when you got your first license, or was it the same license for everyone in those days?
No, as I recall, there were 2 licenses. One was basic and the other was advanced. The basic license required a minimal amount of code capability, and the advanced required more capability, but it gave you radio telephone privileges. So I started out with that basic license and operated for a year, and then got the advanced license and went on from there. In the States, you had a very confusing situation with all kinds of different license classes. I think perhaps you still do. And I don't know what they have in Israel, but...
yeah, we have like technician class, general class, and extra class now.
A novice. There was a novice class at one point there, too. Okay, well, I believe there was a novice class at the time that I was licensed or soon after. And it was an entry-level license class. Probably that's where I would be if I was an American at that time.
Do you remember a first contact?
Oh, very much so. My first mentor of the day was a guy by the name of Howie Wyman, V1 Hotel Charlie. And he kind of nurtured my path towards the license. And he gave me my first contact. It was on 80 meters. We were probably a mile and a half apart. And we probably didn't need radio for him to hear my hand shaking against the key. You know how that was. Good old J38 hand key. Terrible thing. But we got through the contact. And then I had a lot more after that. And CW skills improved tremendously. CW has always been my favorite mode. I always said that English is my first language, Morse code is my second language, and my Spanish comes a very distant third. But these days, I can probably copy 40 words a minute in my head if the fist is good. The keys that I use are bug keys, semi-mechanical, semi-automatic mechanical keys from Vibroplex. I've tried all the different ways of sending code, typing and peers and bugs and so forth. But for me, the bug is the way to go.
No, it's my understanding that you're a lefty.
Well, I'm a lefty, but at the time that I bought my first bug, I didn't know there were left-handed bugs available. So the bug that I bought was a right-handed bug, and I learned to send CW on a right-handed bug by using it backwards. So I pull my dits and I push my DAWs, and it was about 5 years after I started doing all that, and I was pretty good at it by that time, that I read this article, probably in a QST magazine, and it said, so I thumbed a fast 5. And I said, well, that doesn't make sense. I said, 5 is did. And I don't thumb my dits, I thumb my DAWs. I wonder if I'm using this key backwards. Well, as it turned out, I was, but it was too late to switch by that time. And so I still do.
Yeah, why change something that's working for you, right?
Absolutely. Besides, the hand-brain combination was thoroughly fixated on what I was doing, and it would have been very awkward to go all the way back and start learning how to do it all over again.
As ham radio was the engine that drove your life, did ham radio make a difference in the choices that you made for your education and career out of high school?
Oh, absolutely. Not so much in high school. High school for me was boring. It didn't have any appeal. The courses were easy. I used to cram for exams in the last day or so and pass them relatively easily. And I was more interested in ham radio type activities than scholastics. But what was I going to say? As I moved forward, I realized that the only thing I was really interested in or had any talent for, it's bad grammar, was electronics. And so I went looking for electronics schools. I studied electrical engineering at Dalhousie University in Halifax for a year, failed miserably because none of the courses were involved in electronics or electricity. It was all this basic stuff like surveying and so forth. So that only lasted a year.
And the math?
The math. Well, of course there was math, and I was not very good at math. But anyway, I discovered that there was a school in Halifax called the Halifax County Vocational High School, and they had a 2-year electronics course. So I signed up for that, and I did fine at that because, of course, it was electronics and becoming my passion. The instructor, as it turned out, was a guy who was a graduate of the only formal electronics school in Canada at that time. They taught other things besides electronics, but I was only interested in the electronics. And that was the Ryerson Institute of Technology, RIT, in Toronto. And so about the time I finished this course with this instructor, I already had the information from him on how to contact this school and go on from there. But I have a story to tell you about the Halifax County Vocational High School. In the course of the course, we had to bug a radio transmitter, and we, meaning a team of students, and another team of students had to debug it. And he divided us up into teams of 3 or 4, something of that sort. And he had this big old 6-foot transmitter. I forget what it was at this point in time, but it had lots of transmitter type parts in it. Well, I was building my own transmitters by that time, so bugging a transmitter was pretty straightforward for me. So I said to the other fellows in my team, let's bug this transmitter so that the opposing groups actually put the fault in place rather than fix the fault. I'm sorry, becoming a little muddled here. So the whole idea was to do something to the transmitter such that the repair team would come along, they would find the bug that we had inserted, and they would put it back. And in doing so, they would make the transmitter stop working. So what I did, as I recall, was get the biggest 0.001 microfarad high voltage disc ceramic capacitor that I could find, and I soldered it across the output network of the transmitter. And then I cut one of the leads. So the transmitter was working fine when the repair team came along to fix it. But of course, they did a reconnaissance first to see what they could find that might be wrong. And the first thing they found was the broken lead on that capacitor. So they repaired the capacitor lead, thus inserting a bug into the transmitter. It took them ages to figure out the fact that they had put the bug in, not us. And eventually they removed that capacitor and everything started working again. And that was probably the start of my major career in electronics, because I ended up repairing electronic instruments for the University of Toronto, a very wide range of instruments and all kinds of different problems, as you can possibly imagine. But that was the start of it.
Didn't you have a story there in terms of the university didn't actually know how to manage their instruments? Was that something that you wrote to me about?
That's how I got started there. I worked after I graduated from Ryerson. I had a 3-year diploma in electronics engineering, and I went to work for an outfit in Halifax, a British outfit actually, called EMI Kosser, and they used to do government work, and so they had an electronic instrument maintenance facility, and that maintenance facility could call back any of the electronic instruments for recalibration when their time came due. And this was because, of course, the measurements that this lab did had to be traceable back to what you would call the National Bureau of Standards. It wasn't just a willy-nilly oscilloscope that they picked up and made a measurement. There was a sticker on the front of it that said, last calibrated, ... And those calibration adjustments were done back to a known standard that everybody accepted. So in my early history of electronics, I already knew about instrument maintenance and the requirement to do so. This company folded after a couple of years, and there was nothing else in the Halifax area that I could find that was interesting to me. So I decided to go back to Toronto. I called up a couple of my Ryerson instructor friends and said, find me something to do in Toronto because here I come. And one of them had an associate who happened to be the chairman of the Department of Electrical Engineering at University of Toronto. And my instructor called up his friend and said, hey, I've got this former student that wants to come back to Toronto, and he's an honors graduate from our Ryerson program in electronics technology, and I think he would be an asset to your department, blah, blah, blah. And I got the job. And I was hired as a technician. Well, okay. So anyway, it was a start. So I drove up to Toronto, that's another story, and started working for the University of Toronto. Well, my theory has always been that time spent in reconnaissance is never wasted. So in my first couple of days at the University of Toronto, I did a survey of all of the electronic instruments in the department. And because I had been hired more or less to do work on those instruments, I discovered that nobody else was. We had an old Tektronix, I think it might have been a 457 oscilloscope, big, huge thing, vacuum tube oscilloscope. And it would turn itself off after a half an hour because it was overheating. And it was overheating because nobody was cleaning the air filters. And so the story goes. If you took 12 of their oscilloscopes, all the same model, and made the same measurement on it, you would get 13 different answers. So the students always had the feeling that they couldn't trust the instruments that they were using in the lab. It was somebody else's fault, but it wasn't the instruments. So armed with all of this information, I went to the chairman of the department, a guy by the name of Gordon Slemon at that time, very elegant fellow. And we had this conversation. And I said, this is the situation in your department. with your equipment. I said, it's not being calibrated. There's no connection back to the National Bureau of Standards. And so if you make the same measurement with all similar instruments, you get 12 different answers. So I said, first of all, your students don't trust the equipment because they know this, students being fairly smart. And I said, there's a more serious problem here. And that is that there is no scientific basis, in fact, for all of the research work that your graduate students are doing towards their graduate degrees, their master's degrees, and their PhDs. If somebody wants to question any of those research efforts, all they have to do is look at the equipment that was used to make the measurements. They're not traceable back to any kind of standard, and therefore they're invalid, which means that all of the PhDs and master's degrees that you're issuing have no basis in fact. Well, that kind of caught his attention, as you can imagine. And I said, you don't really need another technician here. I said, I happen to be an electronic instrument expert. Well, that was laying it on a bit thick, but I did come from that experience back in Halifax. I said, what you really need is somebody to maintain, calibrate, and perhaps repair your inventory of electronic instruments and make sure that the measurements that they make are all traceable back to known standards so that your measurement, your master's and your PhD degrees are no longer invalid. Well, he thought that was a great idea. And he said, can you do that? I said, sure, I can do that. So he gave me a lab. He gave me a budget for some very fancy test equipment and basically said, go to it. So I went to it for the next 23 years. All I had to do then was become an instrument expert. And that was just a matter of diligence and study and talking to people, practice, and the will of the Lord. And it happened.
And now this mid-show break. The QSO Today project now has over 500 podcast episodes and hundreds of hours of virtual ham radio expo presentations, all freely available and fully supported by you, the listener. This short message and the later mention of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast are the only breaks in the program. QSO Today has no commercial sponsors, so no one influences the content or direction. This project exists solely to promote amateur radio and the people who make it thrive. Producing QSO Today is like a half-time job. Your support at any level covers the tools, hosting, and production costs that keep it going. And while it is a labor of love, it isn't free. Only about 6% of listeners contribute. Please consider making a donation. Use the slider on our donations page to set up the amount that reflects the value that you get from each episode or from our library of educational videos. Make it monthly to help secure the next 500 episodes. You can also become a listener sponsor, shop on Amazon using our referral link, share QSO Today with friends, subscribe to our mailing list and YouTube channel, and help spread the word. Every action is value for value. Keep QSO Today alive by taking action now. We return to our QSO. What were you doing in ham radio during this 23 years?
Oh, a lot, actually. I was very active. I started out in this little upstairs flat down in the east end of Toronto, not too far from the Lake Ontario beach. I subsequently filled it with a new bride, and we were there for 6 or 7 years. And I had 100-watt capability, basically, and whatever wire antennas I could get up. But I was doing a lot of home brew, a lot of home building, because suddenly I had the world's best test equipment available to me at the university, plus their machine shop capabilities. And I thought, gee, it's the time to start doing a little bit of serious building. So I did. The semiconductor era had begun, and I learned how to do semiconductor electronics. I wasn't using that 150-watt soldering iron anymore. I had a good collection of modern tools, and I was building multi-band converters, for example, little solid-state converters for a receiver. And I built a bunch of transmitters. Anyway, one day I got a telephone call after a couple of my design articles had come out in either 73 or Ham Radio magazines. They were two of the construction magazines of the day. got this telephone call from Bill Orr, W6SAI, who I had read about. As a matter of fact, before I left Halifax, I had, I think, the 19th, 17th, 16th, the 14th edition of Bill Orr's Radio Handbook. I think it had a red cover. And in there was an amplifier. It was a pair of 811As in push-pull, if you will, cross-neutralized, plug-in coils. And the reason I was interested in this was that I had acquired a power supply from one of my ham friends in a swap. It was about a 750-volt power supply with 300 or 400 watts of capability. And I wanted something to tie to it. Well, in those days, if you needed something, generally you built it yourself. This is back still in the late 50s, maybe early 60s. And I found this 811A amplifier in Bill Orr's Radio Handbook. And I built it. And by gosh, it worked. And I had a lot of fun with it, used it for a lot of years. And anyway, jumping forward in time now, I got this telephone call from Bill Orr, who was the editor of this handbook that I had owned. And he asked me if I was interested in building an all-band receiver for him. Oh, thought that was an interesting challenge. So I said, sure, let's do it. He said, it's a no expense spared project. He said, you spend the money, send me the bills. He said, I'll reimburse you, but I want a state-of-the-art receiver, solid state, for the upcoming editions of the Radio Handbook. Well, you present a ham technologist with an idea like that and an unlimited budget. I seem to remember spending $60 on the band switch. The local radio emporium of the day was a place called the Electrosonic Supply Company, and they could sell me most of the parts that I needed to build this receiver. They had slug-tuned coil forms and Hammond transformers, Hammond chassis, all the bits and pieces that I needed. And I found this very nice cabinet that I could build the receiver into. But I spent $60 just on the band switch. Now, let me tell you, my friend, in those days, $60 was a lot of money. I'm sorry?
Yeah, I think in those days that might have been a week's worth of pay for some people. I think my father was making $90 a week or something like that as a teacher.
Yeah, probably you're right.
Yeah.
It was a very expensive band switch. This was about 1969 or 1970 at that time. So we're a little further ahead than the $90 paycheck. But still, it was a lot of money to spend on a switch. But it was Bill Orr's money. So eventually, I got this receiver built. He wanted a digital readout on it rather than a mechanical dial. And I didn't have the capability at that time of doing digital design or producing printed circuit boards. But hey, I was at the University of Toronto. We had all kinds of graduate students doing all kinds of advanced things in all kinds of different areas. And most of the graduate students of the day in electrical engineering were my buddies, because they knew that interesting things happened in my lab and they kept wandering by to see what I was up to. I put the question to a couple of them. They said, oh, we could do that. We could make you printed circuit board with the digital counter on it that would be your display. And I had these fancy display chips. They were light emitting diodes. They were not 7-segment. 7-segment was becoming very popular, but I didn't like the display. They were actually rounded numbers that they displayed. And I think I had 4 of them. And in fact, Bill Orr may have supplied them with a spec sheet and so forth. And I gave these to the graduate students and I said, let's see what you come up with. And I showed them, other editions of Bill Orr's handbook. I said, I'm building the receiver as a design project for this handbook, and it will come out in a future edition. Well, that kind of caught their eye. So they went away and did their thing, and they ultimately produced this very nice printed circuit board with the display chips on it and all the electronics to drive the chips. And all I had to do was input signals from the output of the VFO. And what this digital design was going to do was display, in effect, kilohertz above the band edge. This is in the very early days of digital readouts. Kilohertz above the band edge. So when it said 250 and you were on 80 meters, that would be 3750 kilohertz. And that was an easy way of getting a digital display. You just counted the signal coming from the VFO and added a little offset to it. So that was my digital readout receiver. But in the course of building this and seeing it come out in the handbook, I had built a couple of other receivers as well. It was about this time that the Tektronix company got together with Sony, the Japanese company, and they wanted to build a portable oscilloscope, one that a lineman could take up a telephone pole, for example, and make measurements 50 feet in the air of waveforms that he wanted to display. Now, one of my buddies by that time was the Tektronix salesman in Toronto, and he came along one day with this little tiny box, which turned out to be the oscilloscope. It was a Japanese Tektronix combination in technology. It was the tiniest oscilloscope you could ever possibly imagine, but it worked. It had about a 20 or 30 megahertz bandwidth. It was a neat little thing. But what captured my interest was the fact that it was so small. And I thought I could probably build a multi-band receiver that small if I put my mind to it. So I did. And when I had it, and I had photographed it and so forth, and wrote it up, I sent all the information to Bill Orr. And Bill Orr said, "Oh, I like that." He said, we'll put that one on the next handbook too. And then I had another receiver that I had built, which was basically a single band tunable 80-meter receiver. And this was going to be a tunable IF for converters that I would operate in front of it. So you come in at 20 meters and you'd output at 80 meters and you go into this receiver and the receiver would do its thing. So it was called a tunable IF. And this one, as I recall, had a very neat HRO type dial on the front of it. I had acquired an HRO dial, actually acquired about 4 of them, and the gear drives that went along with. And I wanted to use one of these things in a receiver design. And this is where I ultimately used it. And Bill Orr liked that one too. So the 19th edition of Bill Orr's Radio Handbook, which came out, I think, in 1972, had 3 receivers in it, 3 receiver designs. And they were all my designs. So it was my claim to fame, if you will. And I used to trot this out to visiting ham and show them the articles in the handbook. This cousin of mine in Detroit, Al Hart, W8BR, was a brilliant guy. He has been described as a genius. He never forgot a thing. He had one of these eidetic memories. I think that's the correct word. He never forgot anything that he read. And he could go on and on and on for 3 days about all the characteristics and qualities of a diode. It was the most amazing performance I ever saw. But he was not easily impressed. And he did not suffer fools gladly, as the phrase goes. But when I came up one day with this handbook and showed him Bill Orr's Radio Handbook with my 3 receiver designs in it, that impressed him. And from then on, when other visiting hams would arrive, when I happened to be there, and I'd drive down to Detroit periodically to spend a few days with them, he'd say, "This is my ham cousin, VE3GFN, the guy who has the receiver designs in the Bill Orr's Radio Handbook." That's always the way he introduced me. So if I accomplished nothing else, I managed to impress my cousin. And that was not easily done.
What would have been the rigs in the 70s that you were operating in?
Oh, well, the Drake twins come immediately to mind because there was a whole series of Drake twins, starting with the
TR3s, right?
What's that?
TR3, TR4?
TR3, TR4. The TR4s, those were the transceivers.
That's the transceivers,
there
right.
There was also a receiver-transmitter combination as well. R3s and R4s and so forth. I've almost forgotten the model number now as it was so far back. But I had them all in a whole series, and they were great. And those were my first transceivers because you could couple the receiver to the transmitter and you'd had a transceive capability. The first commercial radio I ever had was a Heathkit DX35. I had a whole bunch of homebrew stuff. And my first transceiver was the Kenwood TS850. And it kind of like the repair shop that we had in Toronto. One of the local radio outlets ran a repair shop, and they could repair these Kenwoods. And my Kenwood TS-850 was back and forth a lot because it had some design defects in it. It had some problems with some of the chips, but in between, I had a lot of contacts with it. The TS-850 was followed by an Elecraft K3, and the Elecraft K3 was a magical design because it wasn't a classical superhet receiver design in that it had roofing filters. And so it didn't suffer a lot from the usual superhet receiver overload problems, where if I was in a contest and there was some big gun, I'm going to click on this X and make this go away. Oh, there we go. No, didn't work. If I was in a contest and there was a big gun about 10 kilohertz away, I couldn't work very close to this guy because he would be splattering in my receiver. But with the K3, and I guess it's subsequent receivers, you could work right up next to this guy, right up next to the kilowatt, and you'd never even hear his splatter. And that was a revelation. And I had that K3 for 13 years. By that time, I was an appliance operator. My basement or home workshop could not match the technology in the K3. And so I never even tried to do technical things to it. I was an operator. And the subsequent rigs that I've had have all been the same. Their level of technology is beyond my home brewing capability. I have to say that by this time, surface mount technology had come in. I'm sure you're familiar with surface mount technology, little teeny tiny components. And I used to say at one point when somebody brought me one of these things, fix it, I said, I can't even see it. And my nightmares of the day surfaced around waking up, going to work, and working on surface mount technology. And I had this handful of surface mount components in my hand, and I sneezed, and the components went everywhere, and they were gone. I mean, they're so tiny that you'd never find them once they were gone. And it was surface mount that eventually was my undoing, I think, along with the computer technology that was now coming into all of the instrumentation. Because when I went to the head of the department at electrical engineering, who said to me, we want you to start servicing this computer-based technology. And I said, well, that's fine, I said, but it's a little new to me, like everybody else. I'm going to need some insights. I'm going to need some training, and I'm going to need some test equipment. And he said, well, why would you need test equipment? And I said, well, this is computer technology. I said, for example, most computers these days have 8 or 10 or 12 information lines that they use for transferring data back and forth. I said, if the computer I'm working on has 12 information lines with my present instrument technology, I have to stack up 6 dual band oscilloscopes, one on top of the other, in order to look at those lines to see what information is being passed. That's not a realistic way of doing it. And he thought for a while, and he said, yes, he said, I can see that happening. So I said, there happens to be such and such course available run by so-and-so that is right up my alley, and it's all about the introduction to this new computer-based technology. I should take that course, and then we'll talk about test equipment. Go for it, he said. So I did. Took the course, really interesting stuff, learned a lot, came back with a list of all of the instruments that this course had said I must have in order to work on this technology. And I think the bill came to $125,000. And I presented this to the chairman of the department, and he said, we'll have to think about that. Well, they thought, but meanwhile, the equipment that required repair was stacking up. And he said, when are you going to get to this pile of instrumentation? And I said, well, as soon as you buy me some new equipment so I can make the measurements on it. Because I said, we don't have the capability of servicing this. And he said, well, why don't you learn to do it on the job? That was the phrase that he used. Oh, I said, that's an interesting concept. I said, let's look at other variations in technology. I said, the current fighter aircraft being used are the F-86 Sabre jets. And remember, this is back about 1985, 1987. I said, the current fighter jets these days being used are the F-86. And I said, back in the Second World War, the current bombers were Mosquito bombers. They weren't jets, they were prop planes, totally different technology. I said, if you were a pilot and the maintenance people that were working on your F-86 Sabre jet were the ones who had been working on your Mosquito bombers about 20 years earlier, or maybe 30 years earlier, and they had been told to learn to fix your F-86 Sabre jet, learn to do it on the job, would you be confident in flying that aircraft? Well, he said, that is a point. Well, again, they thought about it. Nothing happened, and eventually I left the department. That was in 1990, and I went on to other things. But I was with the University of Toronto for 23 years, kind of fun, had some interesting stories. Do we have time for a shaggy dog story or two?
I think that once you left the university, I saw somewhere that you actually became a travel log writer. Was that after retirement, or was this part of the journey?
That was sort of in parallel. I got interested in serious photography, 1970, 1975, something like that.
I see.
Started buying some good cameras, and I had a secret weapon in my photography in that my wife was an artist, and she had the most amazing eye for artistic composition that you could imagine. And so she started training my eye. And like most photographers, I guess, if you're serious about it, you want to have your work published. And my entree to getting my work published was to start writing travel articles. And I started publishing those in Canadian travel magazines. And originally they would find their imagery someplace else, but eventually they started using my photography. So I was writing these travel articles and publishing photographs. And my wife and I were doing a lot of travel, didn't have any kids, so we had some extra money and travel was our thing. So we'd go here and we'd go there. Allison would do a lot of sketching. I would do a lot of photography, and we'd come home and write travel articles about our trips. We used to say that we liked to write articles that made you reach for your passport. And I learned after a while that the secret of a good travel article was the opening line. If you could capture the reader with the opening line, you had their interest. So I would look for opening lines when we were traveling. We were on this big wooden sailing schooner at one point on the coast of Maine. She was called name's gone out of my mind. Huge thing anyway. And it didn't have any engines. It only had sails. And the first day, the first mate called us all on board. He said, I want 2 teams of healthy, happy halyard haulers. That was my first line, my opening line, because this boat was a gaff-rigged schooner. And in order to raise the sails, you had to pull up the gaff booms on the top of the sails. And there were halyards for doing this, but it needed a lot of people to haul on those halyards in order to get the sails up. So that was a good opening line. I remember we walked into a bookstore in Albuquerque, New Mexico, the second day that we were in Albuquerque, just in time to hear the owner saying to a couple of his customers, I'd rather be in jail in Albuquerque than free and on the loose in any place else I can find. Now, that was a great opening line.
Did you operate ham radio on these trips, either mobile or portable?
No, never took any ham gear. I would take a lot of camera equipment, tripod, telephoto lens, all the photography equipment that I would require on a trip like that. And that took up enough weight that I didn't want to take ham radio equipment as well. So I had 2 major passions that were driving my engine at that time. Ham radio was one, but photography and travel writing was the other.
Now, you have a lot of awards hanging on the wall of your ham shack, I can see right now. And on your QRZ page, you've got more pictures of your ham shack. Where do those awards come from? Are those from contesting or DXing? Well, what is it that's your passion that you do?
All I have to say is yes and yes, because these days my passion in ham radio, I guess, is contesting, and I've won a bunch of contests. I write a column for the National Contest Journal called the Little Pistols Page, because I am one. 100 watts, modest antennas in the backyard, not your 10 acres full of 100-foot towers topped up with all kinds of aluminum. So I'm at the other end of contesting. And there are a lot of guys like me, or girls too, out there. They're little pistols. And if we compete against ourselves, that's fine. But we don't try to compete against the K3LRs and the VE3EJs, because that's another category entirely. As a matter of fact, I compete against myself. I don't try to compete against anybody else. So I always compete against my own prior scores. And I keep good records of what I did in which contest. And that's full of variables, of course, because radio conditions keep changing. So sometimes they're better and sometimes they're worse. But I have a bunch of favorite contests in which I compete, all on CW, because CW contesting is so quiet. You're working with 200 hertz bandwidths and no splatter from 10 kilowatt phone stations 5 kilohertz away. So that's my passion. I did a lot of DXing in my day. I've got the ARRL 5-band DXCC plaque. I've got the ARRL DXCC honor roll plaque. I did the honor roll with 100 watts and paper QSL cards, which is the difficult way of doing it, and a lot of time. But I did get it eventually. And I've worked all but about 5 or 6 existing countries that probably I'll never work. The first one that comes to mind is North Korea. Not too many people are working North Korea these days. There are a couple of countries in the Indian Ocean that the French don't seem interested in activating, and a few others that I can't bring to mind immediately. But 256 or 300 countries confirmed, or maybe a little more now. And that was a good effort. That required a lot of organization and paperwork, because you needed the QSL cards, of course, paper QSL cards in my day, and you had to collect those from all of these different DXpeditions and then send them off to whoever was sponsoring the award you were chasing. But it came about, shall we say, in the fullness of time. I still do some DXing, but it's more of a rag chewing kind of a thing. But I have been known to spend a week or so chasing one particular DX station, trying to find out which side of the pileup he was listening to. The last one I seem to remember was a guy in the India area. I can't recall exactly which country it was, but it was a DXpedition. The last country I needed, as a matter of fact, for my honor roll. And my wife and I used to rent this cottage up in the Rideau Waterway area of southern Ontario, which is a very countrified area, very historic. We'd rent this cabin for about 3 weeks, and it had this huge field right next to it. And I would put up this huge collinear array, 40-meter collinear array, about 200 feet of wire, fed with open wire line. And on 40 meters, it was a killer. But it would work on all the other bands as well, because I was feeding it with open wire line. And I chased this one particular DX station from this little cabin for about 2 weeks, and finally worked them on 20 meters. And that was my qualifying country for the DXCC honor roll.
And now this mid-show break. Every 2 weeks, I listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George, KJ6VU, Vince, VE6LK, Mark, N6MTS, Thomas, K4SWL, Michael, VA3MW, and Rod, VA3ON, and their guest on often topical and important projects in amateur radio. This discussion amongst the regulars and their guests remind me of the conversations that I used to listen to on 146.94 and 146.46 megahertz in Orange County, California, while working on my own workbench almost 50 years ago. It is amazing how much practical ham radio knowledge that we can absorb by listening to the Workbench podcast that starts to make sense when we start our own deep dive into our own projects. So join me by listening to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast now and as George and crew push beyond 200 episodes. You can get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast by clicking on the banner in this week's show notes page. And now, back to our QSO. Do you use an electronic logbook now?
I do now, yeah. Logger 32. And I started doing that somewhere in that period when I was renting that cottage over about 10 years or so. So I've been using Logger 32 for about 10, maybe 15 years now. I looked at a bunch of them, and that particular software, besides being excellent and free, seemed to be the best of the bunch for what I had in mind and what I required. So it's a pleasure now. I can get a call from some guy I talked to 5 years ago, and I can say, "Oh, hi, Bill. Nice to see you again. How have you been? How's the wife? And did you ever get that hip replacement you were talking about?" It's all in my computer. You can't hide from my computer. A lot better than paper. I threw away all my paper logs eventually.
Do you belong to a local amateur radio club?
Not presently. I have belonged to several in the past, starting with the Halifax Amateur Radio Club back in my early days. But these days there are no active ham radio clubs in the immediate Toronto area that I want to belong to. There really aren't any clubs. They're not doing very much. The whole club idea seems to have died. And the only club I would join would be the one up north of me, the one that sponsors and runs the local repeater that I use, which is VE3GFN. But that club is an hour's drive north of me. And while I go out with them on field day, it's a little far to go up and down, particularly in the middle of the winter. And so I've not joined. But I did belong to a few clubs in my day. I learned a lot from them and, of course, made a lot of friends in the process. The same is true for camera clubs. I've belonged to a few camera clubs in my day and benefited greatly from that membership. The first one was probably a 15-minute drive away from where I presently live. That was the Scarborough Bluffs Camera Club. But all the camera clubs now, because of lack of facilities, keep moving further and further north from me. The Toronto area is a very large area. It has a lot of traffic. And I could drive for a half an hour from where I live and still not reach any of my former camera clubs because they've all moved so far north trying to find this church or that school where they can still afford to meet. The only club that's close to me is, I think it's called the Beaches Camera Club, and it's down in the Lakeshore area of Toronto. It's not very far at all away, and I'll probably rejoin at some point. But lately, I haven't been up to carrying much in the way of camera gear, so I haven't belonged to any camera clubs.
Do you still have a ham radio workbench?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The furnace room in the home which I bought in 1975 originally had this great huge oil furnace in it and the tank that kept it fueled. And that's what it was dedicated for. That was the furnace room. But eventually the oil furnace died and it was replaced with a teeny tiny gas furnace. The big old oil tank also disappeared. And I had all this space in the furnace room. And what was I going to do with it? Well, I found this carpenter guy that I used to work with at the University of Toronto. And he came along and built a whole series of shelves for me in that furnace room. And I still had my old portable workbench, which I had brought up from Halifax back in the day. So it's now my workshop. And incidentally, the furnace room for the gas furnace. And I still do the occasional repair and a little bit of construction on it. The last construction project I did was a new antenna control and switching system, which I built about 3 years ago now, because I had to expand that capability for my contesting. I decided that the contesting mode called SO2R, which is single operator, two receiver, was more than I wanted to get into. But there was another mode called single operator 2VFO. And I started with the K3, which had this capability. And then with my more recent ICOM transceivers, you can, with SO2R, be listening on two frequencies at the same time. You're using one keyboard, using one computer, and using the contesting software N1MM+. You can switch back and forth between those two VFOs with the keyboard. So, for example, I can be doing search and pounce on 20 meter CW, and I can be doing running of stations on 20 meter phone, or let's use two different bands, 40 meter CW and 20 meter phone. So I can be calling CQ on 40 meter CW, but at the same time, I can be listening for search and pounce contacts on 20 meter phone. Or I can be doing the reverse, which is even better. I can be doing search and pounce on 40 meter CW using the band map in the N1MM software to move me with the keyboard up and down the band. But at the same time, I can be calling CQ on 20 meter sideband. And if I get a call on 20 meter sideband, I turn off the opposite receiver and I work the guy on 20 meter sideband. But at the same time, I'm moving up and down the band map of the N1MM contesting software, looking for stations on CW that I haven't worked yet. And when I hear one of those, I stop the process. I'm still listening to my other VFO calling CQ on 20 sideband, but now I'm waiting for a station to become available on 40 CW. Do you get the idea?
Yeah, I got it.
It's easy. It's easier to show you than to describe it.
Do you have a YouTube video of your doing this or something like that? Have you ever made a video of your operating?
Yeah, I actually do. There's a link on my QRZ page to a video that I posted a while ago of my operating CW in a contest. And it's not the greatest video in the world, but it's the only one I ever made in my life. Using my 35 millimeter camera, as a matter of fact, as a video camera. But it means that your overall rate increases mostly in the quiet times of the contest. If the bands are hot, you don't have to use this technique. But on a weekend contest, by Sunday afternoon, you're really scrabbling to find new contacts to make that you haven't already worked. And here's a technique that lets you listen on two bands instead of one, and work two bands instead of one at the same time. Now, my K3 transceiver would let me do this on one band. So I could single band on CW and or sideband, but only on, say, 40 meters. My new transceivers are the ICOM 7610s. I have two of them. So at age 85, I'm the father of twins. And they let me work SO2R multi-mode and multi-band, which is a great advance over the K3. I have to hand it to ICOM. They have produced the transceiver, which is perfect for my requirement. I've had the first one for 8 years. The only problem I ever had with it was finger trouble. It's a complex box, and it took me, I guess, a year or two to finally have it set up the way I wanted it. But it seems to be independent and immune to any stupid thing that I try to do to it. And in the course of contesting, I've switched to a no antenna connector and tried to transmit on it. I've switched to the wrong antennas. Doesn't matter if it sees a high SWR, it turns off the output. It says, that's not going to work, stupid. You've got to do something else. But I've never managed to blow up either one of my ICOM 7610s. I don't imagine I ever will. It is just superb radio engineering. So these transceivers are a long way beyond the capability of my K3. They're also SDR receivers, by the way, the quietest receivers I've ever listened to. Just an amazing receiver. When I got the first one, I put it next to the K3. And on a night when conditions were good, I went looking around on the bottom end of 40 meters for the weakest signals I could find on the K3. And I found a few, and I could hear them, but because of the inherent receiver noise, I couldn't copy them. Remember, the K3 is essentially a classic superhet receiver. But on the SDR receiver, the IC7610, I could hear it and I could copy it. It was just that much difference between the noise level in the K3 and the noise level in the 7610. And that is a great advance in technology. We've come a long way.
Well, so after 70 years of being a ham now and seeing the evolution of technology in radio as well as in computers, what excites you the most about what's happening in ham radio now?
Oh, I guess the continuing advances in the technology. I mean, in the last 10 years, we've gone from classic superhet designs, even using the roofing filter idea of the K3. We've gone from that particular advance over a classic design which had IF filters, and then we've gone to the SDR designs, which are dedicated computers. They're not really radio receivers. They're dedicated computers as far as I'm concerned. But they have that capability of pretending they're a receiver. And they are, as I said, amazingly quiet. So we've gone through two major significant advances in receiver design. Well, I have to say in the last 15 years, because I had my K3 for 13 years before I finally parted company with it. What's coming up in the future? I can't imagine. One of the great advances in receiver design in ham radio has been the spectrum analyzer. The built-in spectrum analyzer for modern transceivers, I think, is a great asset. For contesting, it is a fantastic asset. DXing, it lets you look at frequencies where you want to move your transceiver to call a station, and you can see whether there's another guy there or not before you move, and a number of other advances. I had my first spectrum analyzer, I guess, about 1959. It was a war surplus monster that connected to my receiver of the day, and it would show me the band. I think it was the 80-meter phone band that I was concerned about at that time. And I could see when I called CQ here, there was a spike that suddenly popped up there. And if I tuned up to that spike, it was probably a guy calling. And this is back in the days, I think I may still have been on crystal control. So I had to transmit frequencies where I had crystals. Now, these days, of course, it's a whole different story. But in those days, you called CQ and you were tuning the band. I'd call CQ 80 meters. This is VE180H calling CQ and tuning the band because I was rock bound. And I knew that there were other stations that were rock bound, but they were rock bound someplace else. So you had to tune the whole band to find somebody who was answering your CQ. These days, you don't do that at all. You call CQ and you expect some guy to call you within 100 hertz of your frequency. And if you're using a 200 hertz bandwidth, you won't hear him because he's too far off your frequency. And there's a good use for the spectrum analyzer, because if some guy calls me 500 hertz away, and it happens, and I'm using a 200 hertz bandwidth in my receiver, which is a common occurrence, it's only the spectrum analyzer that will find him because I won't hear him. So we don't tune the band after we call CQ anymore. That's an operating change that's quite significant too, I think.
If you were going to give advice to new hams that are just coming in, or maybe there were old hams who took a 25-year vacation from ham radio to raise a family, and they're coming back into the hobby.
I've encountered a few of those in my day. Yeah.
There's a few of them. What advice would you give them?
Gee, well, I would be inclined to say build your equipment for starters, but it's so difficult to find the correct components that you need anymore.
Well, but there's a lot of kit companies.
That's bad advice.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of kit companies now, I think more than ever before.
Yes, but building a kit is not the same as assembling the parts, drilling the holes, laying it all out. There's not so much learning in a kit.
Right.
Whereas in the day when we built our own equipment, by finding the parts and, as I say, drilling the holes and laying it all out, there was a lot more learning in those days, and perhaps a lot of passion developed for the hobby in the course of doing that. And by the
I think that we were also more hands-on in those days. We're in a disposable, economy now, and I would think that most of the younger people, not to make any generalities, but I guess I could, don't have any hands-on experience. They may not even own a screwdriver.
Well, that's why I'd be inclined to say develop some of those capabilities by building some equipment. So building kits is better than nothing, I will admit. But at the same time, I have to say, when I bought my K3, which was about $4,000 or $5,000 Canadian at that time, and the most expensive radio I'd ever bought, I wasn't about to build it myself. It was too expensive.
Right.
Mr. Ellicraft would build it for me for an additional $100 or so US. And I thought that was a great bargain. So I had the factory build it. And when I turned it on, it worked. A very complex radio. And I wanted to make sure that for that price, it worked. So I didn't want a kit. And this coming from a dedicated home brewer is quite a change in philosophy, I have to tell you. But as I said, I'm now more of an appliance operator. As far as the advice to the kids, I would say get away from your VHF transceiver and your 6-inch antenna. Get yourself an HF transceiver of some kind or another, and probably not the most expensive one you can find, because you don't know yet what your requirements will be. So go find some secondhand or third-hand transceiver that still works, put up an antenna, start listening, start making contacts. You might develop a passion for CW. A lot of people seem to, even though it's no longer a licensing requirement. But there are a lot of advantages in using CW over radio telephone. But the real radio is still below 50 megahertz, shall we say. And if you want to get the most out of ham radio, I think that's where you want to go.
Mike, I want to thank you so much for joining me today on QSO Today. It's been a while since I've actually interviewed anybody from Canada, and I think the Canadian perspective is always interesting. It's different. It's different enough from America that it's interesting in terms of the way that maybe you approach the hobby or approach the availability of devices. Although it seems to me in this world now, you can get just about anything shipped anywhere. I just got an order from DigiKey the other day, and so it's nice that I can do that. But anyway, I just want to
use Amazon a lot.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah.
Rather than go shopping these days, I just use Amazon, and it comes free. It comes in a day or two, and I don't have to go chasing around in the car trying to find a store that has exactly what I want.
Or in the snow, for example, too.
Or in the snow, and we've got a big bunch of snow in Toronto right now, yes.
Anyway, I thank you so much for joining me on QSO Today, and I just want to, again, thank you and wish you 73.
I've enjoyed it very much, Eric. It's been a pleasure to spend the time with you. I feel quite honored that you contacted me and invited me to be here. And sorry for the audio problems, but we managed to overcome those. I think it worked out very well. It's been a lot of fun.
73. That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Mike. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in VE3GFN in the search box at the top of the page. You can sponsor the transcription of this episode or any of the previous episodes by clicking on the transcription button on every show notes page. The cost is $75 per episode, regardless of the length. We will quickly transcribe the episode and give you credit for your sponsorship. Please send us the call sign of the podcast to make sure that we transcribe what you want. Remember that QSO Today is value for value. Please support our project by making a donation or becoming a listener sponsor today. Use our Amazon link before shopping at Amazon, as we receive a small commission on your Amazon purchases. Subscribe to our mailing lists, both my blog and the podcast, and forward the messages to friends and family who would enjoy QSO Today content. Promote us on social media and give us a 5-star rating and reviews whenever you are asked. QSO Today is available on every podcast player and venue, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and Podcasting 2.0. Get a Podcasting 2.0 player to make it easy to get your next episode as soon as we publish. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.